Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. I'm pleased that I can welcome again Professor Thomas O'Loughlin to a new broadcast. And today we're going to talk about Pentecost. When we look in the scriptures, 1 Corinthians 16, 5-8, it says, "After I go through Macedonia, I will come to you, for I will be going through Macedonia. Perhaps I will stay with you for a while, or even spend the winter, so that you can help me on my journey wherever I go. For I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits. But I will stay at Ephesus until Pentecost." Tom, what do you think? What does Paul mean when he says, "I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost"?
We Christians think of Pentecost as something that is very much our Christian feast. And we always link it with the coming of the Holy Spirit 50 days after Easter, because that's the way it's presented in Luke's Gospel in the first chapters of the Acts of the Apostles. But it's worth remembering that Pentecost is just the Greek name for the Jewish festival of Shavuot. And all of the Greek-speaking Jews at the time of Paul in the first century, there are Jewish communities all across North Africa, the coast of North Africa, and all around the northern coast of the Mediterranean. So the whole of the Mediterranean world, in every city there's a Jewish community. And these Jewish communities, they worship God in Greek. They read the scriptures in Greek, what we call the Septuagint. And they name the festivals in Greek. So they didn't celebrate Pesach, but Pascha. They didn't celebrate Shavuot, but Pentecost. And Pentecostes literally means the 50 days, the day of the 50th. The funny thing is, every Jewish community by the first century celebrated Pentecost. And they would continue to celebrate it, and still do today, except they've now gone back to the Hebrew name. The funny thing is, within Judaism, Pentecost was a day of great celebration, but it wasn't linked to any particular historical event. Pesach, Pascha, that was linked to going through the Red Sea and leaving Egypt. And then it was leaving Egypt and going through the Red Sea. So it's linked to the story of Exodus. But Pentecost, it was a great festival. Everyone enjoyed celebrating it. Some people said, well, it must be, since it's a joyful festival, it must be to celebrate the giving of the law. And around the exact time that Paul was traveling and preaching and indeed writing to the Corinthians, that's what Philo said. In his book on the special laws, he goes through the feast and he says, well, this is the feast of the giving of the law. And that's why it's so great, such great fun. The funny thing is, for Paul, we don't know what Pentecost was, except that it was a great feast of rejoicing in God's goodness. That's all we can say about it. Did he link it to a particular thing? We've no evidence that he'd linked it to what Philo said. We've no evidence that he would have linked it to the idea of the coming of the Spirit. He seems to have no special time for the coming of the Spirit. But it's a very important festival. He must celebrate it because he is a good Jew and he clearly loves the idea of celebrating it. And he's going to celebrate it in Ephesus. And I think the reason he's celebrating it in Ephesus is simply that he's spending a lot of time in Ephesus, and it was clearly a church that was very welcoming to him, and he enjoyed himself. Whereas the Corinthians were on the other side of the Aegean Sea. They're full of problems. So, well, I'm going to get you. I'll get you as soon as I can. I might even spend next winter with you, in which case I'll travel over towards the end of the summer. But one thing, I don't want to just make a passing visit. In other words, he could have got a boat across to Corinth. It would have been 2 or 3 days at sea. No, he's not going to do that. He's going to wait until he can spend real time with them. And there's a hint, I'll do this further down the road. Meanwhile, I must stay here. And he hints earlier in the letter that he's writing the letter around the time of Pascha, Pesach, Passover, Easter. So he's saying, well, I'm going to stay here at least now for the next month or so here in Ephesus. Once I've got Pentecost over, then I'll think about you. I might even get you by next winter, but it's not going to be a passing visit. So we see the whole tension in Paul's relationship with the Corinthian church. And also we see how deeply embedded Paul was within the Jewish sacred year. And of course, the Jewish sacred year becomes, with changes, the Christian year. But there's another interesting thing for us. We Christians tend to think of the Christian year as if it were cut fresh from whole cloth around the time of Jesus. It was inherited. It was inherited. And then the next question was for Christians, well, if it was inherited, what does it mean? And it's only in an attempt to answer what would it mean, the same question that Philo was asking in the 50s or 60s, same time as Paul. Paul is probably writing in the late 50s, that the Christians say, well, okay, we're having this great festival. We're having it 50 days after Easter. So what happened 50 days after Easter? And it's Luke who then comes in and says, well, Easter is death, resurrection. Then there's a period after Easter, appearances. And then he promises this. So Luke is the one who says it's the coming of the Spirit. And that's what becomes the standard Christian story. But we were celebrating the festival before we had a reason for celebrating the festival. And I think that's fascinating because it tells us, number one, just how rooted all the followers of Jesus were within Judaism. They weren't yet in any way trying to make a distinction between themselves and the Jews. That's a 2nd century idea, probably first found in the Gospel of John. Second, it shows how being festive and thanksgiving to God is rooted in the basic DNA of monotheists, whether one calls himself a Jew or a follower of Jesus or a Christian. Thirdly, it says, once we have a memory, we start linking things together. So we linked the festival, which we do every year, with the coming of the Spirit, which is, of course, something that is really beyond time, and which, in a way, it's a good catechetical thing to link the coming of the Spirit with a particular day. But at another level, the Spirit is coming all the time, every day, and inhabiting every human heart. So,
of the other feast days that we have in the church, they often come from pagan feasts.
Christmas and Rogation days,
Yes.
which we don't celebrate any longer, but some Christians still celebrate Rogation days. They came from a Roman sowing festival for sowing grain. But here's one which reminds us of our Jewish roots,
Yeah.
and also reminds us that celebrating the festival and being thankful is more important than the meaning that we give it, which is secondary.
I also wonder, because I know that the tradition of the Jewish people is to go 3 times to Jerusalem, and Shavuot was one of these occasions to go to Jerusalem, so to do a pilgrimage. And Pentecost is also, at least in Germany, it's definitely a feast day when you do a little procession. So it's like a mini pilgrimage.
Well, you see, every culture takes its days and interprets them within its own situation. Instead of asking, what's the original? We should ask, what can we learn from one another?
Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Out there, heroic peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world, a new day dawning and shining.